The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
It's the battle of titans, COVID-19 versus the economy. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. People need to stay alive and healthy, but they need money to live, too. And after 26 million people filed for unemployment in the last 5 weeks in an economy that was the envy of the world just a few short weeks ago, President Trump and all 50 state governors now face a crucial pivot point, trying to balance protection of the public's health with a growing urgency to reopen America for business. We'll bring on a trio of authors from LibertyNation.com to discuss some of the many tentacles of this crisis. Dave Patterson on the COVID fallout for China and reports that North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un is in failing health. Chief Political Correspondent Graham Noble on how COVID has affected the candidacy of Joe Biden. And Legal Affairs Editor Scott Cosenza jumps on board for Talkin' Liberty, highlighting states refusing to allow at-home COVID tests, one state planning to sue China, plus a rogue judge trampling on free speech.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
Commence the proceedings with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. 50 states, 50 governors, 50 different plans for trying to reopen the economy after this blight which has cost the nation and the world so dearly, to the point where many of us are overcome with anxiety and wonder over what the post-COVID world will look like. One of the governors who's decided to end the lockdown of his state at the end of this month is Ron DeSantis of Florida, who says his approach has offered the right blend of health and the economy.
You go back 6 weeks. Everybody was saying Florida was going to be worse than New York. Obviously, we have a very elderly population. If you look at what's happened, that's not true. New York, for example, has about 25 times the number of fatalities of Florida, even though we have 2 million more people. People said our hospitals were going to be overrun. We've actually increased hospital bed space and ICU bed space during the pandemic. So there were fewer beds available in Florida in February than there are now. You can do both. You can continue to fight COVID-19, but also get people back to work and have society function again.
But it's become increasingly clear that this whole COVID crisis has now descended into a political battle, with President Trump and most GOP governors prone to accelerate reopening, while the left attacks them for heartlessness and wants to keep the shutdown going for many more weeks or months. In fact, the most famous young leftist in the country goes even further. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
When we talk about this idea of reopening society, only in America does when the president tweets about liberation, does he mean go back to work? I think a lot of people should just say, no, we're not going back to that. We're not going back to working 70-hour weeks just so that we could put food on the table and not even feel any sort of semblance of security in our lives.
So what AOC just said is that people shouldn't have to actually work to put food on the table. even as we watch healthcare workers on the front lines risk their lives every day. But let's cut through the niceties here. AOC and her fellow travelers on the left are appearing to enjoy the fact that the economy built during the presidency of Donald Trump is tanking. Because, of course, that gives them a better chance to unseat him in November. But the problem really is their own candidate. If anything, Joe Biden's cognitive issues seem to have worsened. This week, he was interviewed for 17 minutes and never looked at the camera on his home computer. But what will haunt Biden for the duration was his recent inability to even repeat the most basic element of the Declaration of Independence.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by you know the thing.
Yes, we know the thing. Problem is, we're not sure if you do. And rest assured that the Trump campaign is ready to absolutely eviscerate the former vice president for his endless string of gaffes. And this one from recent days is likely to be prominent.
You know, there's during World War II, where Roosevelt came up with a thing that was totally different than he called it the World War II. He had the War Production Board.
Yes, folks, that guy wants to be your next president. We'll talk more about the state of the Biden campaign with LibertyNation.com chief political correspondent Graham Noble in a bit. But one more thing before we move on. Remember the investigation by Attorney General Bill Barr and investigator John Durham into FISA abuse and spying on the 2016 Trump campaign by the Obama Justice Department? Yeah, you probably forgot about it. But it's still very much alive, according to the Attorney General, appearing on the syndicated Hugh Hewitt radio show. And the fact it's an election year won't stop the momentum.
As far as I'm aware, none of the key people whose actions are being reviewed at this point by Durham are running for president. In its core, the idea is you don't go after candidates. You don't indict candidates or perhaps someone that's sufficiently close to a candidate that it's essentially the same, within a certain number of days before an election. But I don't think any of the people whose actions are under review by Durham fall into that category. Failure to follow the guidelines and the requirements in preparing FISA applications, is very disturbing. And, we shouldn't proceed with FISA unless we have safeguards that ensure that the law is being scrupulously followed by the FBI.
The question now is, with all the water that's passed under the dam since the whole impeachment business ended in January, and the nation still in the midst of a public health crisis, will people still care about spying on the Trump campaign and flagrant abuse of the FISA process 4 years ago? We'll find out. Quick break, and then we're back to discuss what the heck we're going to do about China.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Exhausted by all the fake news? On LibertyNation.com's YouTube channel, facts and fresh, bold analysis are what you get without the leftist spin. Subscribe today to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel because
truth
is making a
comeback.
Combat propaganda and defend freedom at Liberty Nation Gen Z. LNGenZ.com is your portal for news, videos, and worksheets without the spin. LNGenZ.com. A free-thinking future starts here.
We believe that all men are entitled to blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
As the world continues to come to grips with a threat like none we have ever witnessed before, virtually the entire world shut down due to a virus from a freaking bat. We turn our lonely eyes to Asia and the threats posed by China, source of the virus, and of all manner of false information in the ensuing wreckage, which has cost who knows how many lives and fortunes. And now perhaps China's client state, North Korea, under its rogue regime still advancing an aggressive nuclear program, sending forth word that the dear leader Kim Jong-un is in the hospital in faltering health. Joining us to try and sort out the growing list of issues in our relationship is the newest member of the LibertyNation.com team, Dave Patterson. Hello, Dave.
Tim, good to be with you.
Well, good to have you back. Now, we can be certain that our relationship with China will change once this crisis is behind us. But enumerate for us, if you would, the list of particulars that China will have to answer for when this is over, and the most significant ways our relationship with the Chinese is likely to change.
First of all, when China knew that they had a problem, why did they keep it to themselves? Why didn't they tell the world right away that there was a problem in Wuhan? And had they, we could have taken steps to help alleviate that problem. Secondly, I think that, once you knew there was a problem, Beijing, what prompted you, instead of helping to work through the problem, but to turn and blame others for the problems you were facing? I mean, first of all, they blamed the Italian army. And then secondly, they blamed the U.S. Army, which was not helpful for anyone. And I guess lastly, the question would be, why are you now hoarding masks and protective equipment? What possible purpose could you have for that other than charging outrageous amounts for it? And
that would be it. Yes, that would be it.
Silly.
Do you believe anything the Chinese say? Do you believe any of the information that they send out through their state-controlled media? Should we believe any of it?
I think you should be very skeptical about what the Chinese say generally, and more specifically with regard to this Wuhan COVID-19 problem.
Okay, fair enough. Now, there have been various reports that China either accidentally let this virus loose in wet markets, that it escaped the infamous Wuhan laboratory some other way, that it was created by accident and then released deliberately, or even that it was created in a lab deliberately to infect the world. Which of these narratives rings most true?
Well, I think that we've heard a lot of speculation. I don't think we will ever know exactly what happened in Wuhan, but I don't think that in the end it's going to matter. What matters is once they knew they had a problem, why did they do everything possible to divert attention from them and to spread their propaganda around the world?
And it's not just the U.S., but the rest of the world that is certainly going to take a new look at their relationship with China, their dependence on them. But let's move on to an article that you wrote on LN this week about the lack of reliable intelligence on the ground in China, which probably cost us big time in this crisis. How so, and why is our intel from China not more exhaustive or accurate?
Well, as far back as 2017, there were reports that our assets within China had been discovered and were one by one eliminated. And most recently, Fox News had a piece where they again brought out the point that we no longer have good human intelligence assets in China, HUMINT. And those assets, HUMINT, is the most important information that you can have because it puts things in context. I'll give you an example. On 31 December, 175,000 people left Wuhan. Now, wouldn't that have been nice to know? During the entire month of January, 7 million people left that region. That's like the entire city of New York going to Miami. We would have probably discovered or thought that something was going on had we known those things.
Well, now, there are credible reports that China, once they learned about the virus, how deadly it really is, and it's 3 times more catching than the flu, so to speak, that what they did was make sure to protect their domestic markets. They have 7 cities of over 10 million people in China. It seems that they protected their domestic flank and lied in many ways to the rest of the world. Is that a fair charge to make?
I think it is. I think it's consistent with the way in which they view their geopolitical status in the world.
No question. It's all about world dominance. It's not about getting along. It's in the Chinese character, has been for a long time. But you say in that same article I just referred to that China has imprisoned or executed multiple U.S. intelligence sources, leading to speculation that the Chinese have some sort of mole inside the CIA. Is there reason to believe this is true?
I think reports are between 18 and 20 have been either executed or put in prison. More probably, it would be a hacking of the communication system between the United States and the assets on the ground. That's the more likely situation.
Let's get to North Korea here. Do you believe that Kim Jong-un is actually in failing health? And if so, what does this portend for the relationship Trump has worked so hard to build with this communist dictator? And if he's not sick, why would North Korea want us to think that he is?
Probably Kim Jong-un had a medical problem. Reports out of South Korea suggest that that was true. On the other hand, you have the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs who recently pointed out that it appears as though he is in control of the government. I think, too, that the reason we know so little is because there is so much secrecy that surrounds the Kim family and most specifically the dear leader. And so it's very difficult to know precisely what's going on. I do think, though, that regardless, there is little chance that North Korea will change its stripes anytime soon.
Well, let me just say what my view has been about this all along, which is that the one thing that North Korea has, the one thing, their people starve, they're imprisoned, they have no political freedom, the one thing they have is nuclear weapons. Do you really think that Kim Jong-un would, under any circumstance, actually give up nuclear weapons, given that that would be an agreement with Trump? And Kim Jong-un, if I'm him, I say, well, what happens when Trump leaves the White House? The next guy can come in and tank the deal, and now I have no nuclear weapons left. I have no power. I've given it all away.
I'm sure that's the view looking through the lens of North Korea. But it also kind of tells you of the naivete with which they might view the United States, because when we make a deal, it's not just a person in a part of our government who makes that deal. It is President Trump as a representative of the United States of America.
Dave, that's about all the fun we're allowed to have. Thanks for joining us again.
Hey, thank you. Enjoyed it.
Dave Patterson, LibertyNation.com. We'll take a quick break and come back to discuss the ups and downs and in and outs of Joe Biden.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
So Joe Biden continues to embarrass himself even as he's forced to stay in his house in Delaware trying to run a presidential campaign. As we played you in our Say What segment, this week's red-faced episode for the cognitively challenged presumptive Democratic presidential nominee was to not realize for the full 17 minutes of an online interview that he wasn't looking at the host. He was not looking at the camera. Of course, this is just another in a long line of head-shaking episodes that has to make you wonder how this guy's going to make it through another 6 months, especially when President Trump starts getting up in his face and releasing a raging river of gaffes committed by the former vice president. Here to help us figure out how, or perhaps whether, Joe Biden can first make it to November intact, what woman he is likely to pick for his running mate, and how he can actually beat Trump, is our chief political correspondent at LibertyNation.com, the outspoken Graham Noble. Hello, Graham.
Hey, Tim. How you doing?
Good. Welcome back to the show. Do you think all these gaffes and missteps and misstatements by Joe Biden are actually as big a deal to voters as it might appear?
Well, Tim, I mean, it certainly should be a big deal. And obviously to Trump supporters, Republicans, conservatives in general, and I believe probably to a large percentage of the independents out there, this is a very big deal. It is amazing to me that the vast majority of Democrats seem to be just completely ignoring the whole situation, which I think is, I'm sure they must be worried about it, but they're certainly not publicly admitting any concern.
So Trump will use the stumbling and bumbling against Biden, his inability to take command of a crisis like the one we're in now, but also he's going to bring up the lining of his son's pockets based on his foreign relationships with Ukraine, China, and other countries, that he's captive to a radical agenda from the Democratic Party, his status as the ultimate Washington insider, a male version of Hillary Clinton. Which of these arguments do you think, Graham, will be most effective for Trump?
Well, knowing Trump, he's going to use every single one of those arguments within the space of a few words or a couple of sentences every time he speaks about his prospective opponent. I think really, considering what we're going through at the moment, I believe that it's got to the point where China is, in fact, a huge liability for Biden. In fact, I believe there was a new Pew Research Center poll that just came out that says that China's unfavorability rating, for want of a better term, in the U.S. is currently something like 66% or something. 66% of Americans who responded to that survey said they had an unfavorable view of China. And I believe that in the same survey, something like it was either 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 Americans view China as a threat. And I think Biden's undeniable connections, shall we say, to that country is going to prove a liability to him.
Well, of course, Joe Biden has for years been a defender of our relationship with China. And when President Trump shut down the border or shut down flights, shut down travel from and to China, Joe Biden said that it was totally unwarranted and that Trump is a xenophobe, to which Trump responded, I don't think Joe Biden even knows what that word means. But you're right. He's going to have an awful lot of splaining to do about his longtime defense of China. But what, in turn, do you think Biden's best issues will be for attacking Trump?
I think what he's going to do is he's going to try to hit Trump on our disintegrating economy, and he's going to try to play some verbal jujitsu there in terms of making it seem as though the economy and the mess that it's in is actually all down to Trump's not handling the coronavirus issue correctly.
It seems like Trump can't win for losing, because he can claim that he held down the deaths, but at the expense of an economy that is tanking, and that he shouldn't have ordered the whole country shut down, even though we had few deaths. But if we have a lot of deaths, they'll say he didn't do enough. So, I mean, in other words, there's really nothing he can do that he isn't going to be attacked on. So it's all just a matter of what angle the Democrats are going to come from. Now, given that Joe Biden clearly appears to be on, shall we say, the other side of the hill, he'd be the oldest president to take the oath of office at 78 years old. He'd be 82 at the end of his first term when he'd run for 4 more years. Biden's running mate, his selection for vice president, is likely going to be far more important than usual. He's committed to picking a woman. Who would be the best choice?
I think that there are no good options for him, quite frankly. Everyone you can think of has got some issues, let's say. It's hard to, from a Democrat's point of view, I think it's hard to argue that Elizabeth Warren is not probably his best choice, although, of course, she is not a woman of color, unless, of course, you count the 1024th part Native American that she is. But everybody is going on about, checking the identity politics boxes. He's got to pick a running mate who is a woman of color. But, you can't help thinking that from a point of view of name recognition, somewhat of a loyal following, even though they didn't come through for her in the primaries, and also fundraising power, it's hard to argue that Elizabeth Warren is not perhaps his best choice.
Then there's Stacey Abrams, a woman that came within, maybe not a heartbeat, but very close to winning the governor's seat in Georgia, and she became a rising star in the Democratic Party, but she didn't win the governorship. So she's never held elective office beyond the Georgia state level. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of enthusiasm for her on the whole identity politics thing. She checks all the boxes that you could possibly check. She's very well spoken. She's passionate. She's also very left wing. What would you say about her as a running mate? Would she be good? Would she help Biden? Would she hurt him? Would she make no difference?
It's hard to say. I mean, Biden's problem here almost is that he, whether any Democrats want to admit it or not, he really does have to choose a running mate who is capable of taking over as president. I mean, because for a start, even in the event that Biden were to win in November and become president, I don't see a path for him to serve a second term. I really don't. I think if he did win, he's absolutely going to be a one-term president if he even makes it through his first term. So on the one hand, he's got to pick a running mate who is seen by people as competent to jump into the role of the chief executive and commander-in-chief at a moment's notice almost. But also he needs to pick a running mate who's not going to actually upstage him during the campaign.
How's he going to achieve that?
Well, that's exactly, Tim. I mean, I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, I'm glad you don't, because I certainly don't.
No. If I knew the answer to that question, then I guess I'd be running Biden's campaign.
Graham, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tim.
Graham Noble, Chief Political Correspondent for LibertyNation.com. We'll take a quick break and come back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we have reached the portion of Liberty Nation Radio which we entitle Talkin' Liberty. It is self-explanatory, and it's when we reintroduce our guardian of individual liberty, the constitutional lawyer and LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim, and thank you for having me.
Okay, so, Scott, let's just dive right into the COVID stuff. An at-home test has been developed where you can test yourself at home for the COVID virus, but some states are choosing not to allow it.
Well, they ban it, Tim, because the people in those states cannot be trusted to have the liberty and autonomy to decide for themselves what testing they may wish to undergo without the basically approval of state officials through a licensee, like a doctor, pharmacist, or so forth. So this isn't a new ban against COVID-19 testing. This is just a ban against self-testing generally. And of course, the sclerotic bureaucracy of these states doesn't allow for the swift removal of odious regulations in the face of a pandemic.
Scott, what is it about bureaucrats that's seemingly built into their DNA that they cannot trust individual people to make decisions for themselves?
Well, in this case, Tim, we have to blame the Maryland General Assembly and the governors who who have enacted this kind of bureaucracy into state law. And I think part of it stems from this idea that we need authority to kind of tell us what to do, right? Like they'll tell you what the appropriate test is. But of course, authority takes too long to meet and have stakeholders testify and, give impact plans and so on and so forth. And if you're dying or caring for someone who may be at risk of COVID, you just can't wait the year it's going to take for the Maryland General Assembly to sit again in session and pass a new law.
Okay, Scott, so everybody has a different approach on how to take down China for what they've done in this whole COVID crisis. But the state of Missouri has an unusual approach. They are actually suing China.
Well, Tim, I think it's a bit farcical, unfortunately. What it says to me is that the Democrats have no stranglehold on ridiculous taxpayer and time-wasting maneuvers in the face of this crisis. This is from a Republican Attorney General, Eric Schmidt, the Attorney General for Missouri, sued China and alleges, Tim, in the complaint that the Communist Party of China and the Chinese government unleashed the virus on the world. So pretty fantastic allegation by a Missouri governor who we presume does not have a inside track on sino-immunology and intelligence gathering there. So one wonders where he gathers the facts. And I just want to say, Tim, lawyer jokes aside, it is important that people don't use the courts to play games. I don't know what game General Schmidt, Attorney General of Missouri, seems to be playing, but sovereign immunity prevents this case from proceeding. You can't sue China in court in Missouri. It's just, I guess, a headline grabber, or for the Missourians who are ignorant of sovereign immunity and may think he's trying to do something on their behalf.
So, Scott, which has a better chance of succeeding, this lawsuit against China by the state of Missouri or the indictments of those Russian corporate executives by Robert Mueller in the special counsel investigation that he knew would never result in any of those people coming to justice?
Well, Tim, here's the funny thing. In that case, that's actually light years ahead of this Missouri Eric Schmidt case. And the reason why is those people can actually legally be liability can attach to them under our current laws. They're not going to have to pay it, of course, because they're never going to come here, like you mentioned. But China cannot be held liable under our own understanding of law and jurisprudence. Right. It's like, did Attorney General Eric Schmidt go to law school? I think that a better case would be for the citizens of Missouri to sue him for all the hours of state employees that were put into drafting this lawsuit. That case has a better chance of running than the one against China. More often than not, I think we find ourselves railing against Democrat attorney generals who use the power of their office, especially the ones in the Northeast. They seem to be the worst perpetrators. New York, Massachusetts, D.C., of course. But to see, in the midst of the crisis itself, is there nothing better going on in Missouri that the attorney general could do with his time? Well, Tim, sadly, the cynic in me suspects that this is all generated for Mr. Schmidt's political gain and not an attempt to garner any justice for Missourians.
Okay, Scott, this next story involves your party, the Libertarian Party, which has, unfortunately and not surprisingly, had a whole lot of trouble getting on the ballot in a particular state.
One thing that Libertarian Party members and officials have had to deal with since time immemorial is attempts by Democrats and Republicans. One thing that those two parties, Tim, almost universally agree with is third parties should be thwarted at every turn and not allowed to compete on the same field for votes that they are allowed to. We don't have a nonpartisan political system in the country. We have a bipartisan political system. And if you're not a member of the Republican or Democrat parties, you have a tough time getting votes. And one of the reasons why is because those party officials often are able to deny ballot access to third parties. Libertarian Party is the largest third party in the country, and they suffer every basically cycle. They have to go out and canvass and get petition drives to get ballot access. And it's basically, it is, in fact, Tim, just an attempt to thwart those folks from getting any attention or votes. Well, as you might imagine, you can't stand on a street corner and ask people who are going into the mall or the post office, if they'll sign your petition if there's nobody going in there. So therefore, the Libertarians are saying we can't get ballot access because of this shutdown. And in Illinois, Tim, which is one of the many states that is especially anti-third-party candidates, they had to sue. The Libertarians sued in order to get ballot access. And we do have a judgment. It looks like that they will not have to gather all the signatures that they ordinarily would have. Once again, we have a case where the law doesn't contemplate these sorts of lockdowns and also is not nimble or able to change to meet the new reality. So the state of Illinois wanted to enact some new onerous restriction on libertarian candidates, but the judge said if they had been on the ballot previously as a party, then they can be on the ballot again, which seems like an elegant way to sort of wrap up the challenge and yet still maintain some sort of. You can't have 1,000 choices on the ballot. Presumably, it would just become too much of a mess.
Okay, Scott, we've got time for one more story, and it's an important one. A judge at the National Labor Relations Board has ruled that a tweet by Federalist publisher Ben Domenech was unlawful. What's this about?
This case shocked me because, I felt like I was beyond surprised at the kind of overreach of federal regulation, but this one takes the cake. Mr. Domenech's tweet was sent a year or so ago when Vox had a labor union walkout, and he just tweeted out to his staff, hey, Federalist people, if any of you tries to start a union, it's back to the salt mines. Just a funny joke referencing the Vox basically kerfuffle, right? Mm-hmm. Well, a Massachusetts lawyer who does not work for the Federalist and has never worked for the Federalist, his name's Joel Fleming. What he does have is likely an encyclopedic understanding of national labor relations law and also a burning hatred for freedom. He filed a complaint, a National Labor Relations Board complaint against the Federalist and Ben's tweet. It was news to me, Tim, that a third party or fourth party having no relation whatsoever to a certain job site could file a labor complaint against that job. You can imagine if you wanted to frustrate somebody else's business to just file labor complaints about that business having no relation to it. Again, the attorney, Mr. Fleming from Massachusetts, Joel Fleming, was not an employee of the Federalist, has no relation with them. He's just a person who has a Twitter account, Tim, and he saw the tweet. Worse is that Judge Chen of the National Labor Relations Board upheld the complaint as founded and declared the tweet illegal. I think it's a clear and really unmistakable First Amendment broadside.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose with our own Mark Angelides. All available on demand at LibertyNation.com. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty, and for heaven's sake, stay healthy. We'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.